Three, two, one, and we are recording episode 453 with Dr. Chris Gaynor, who wrote about the bomb and the missile age in America. It's an audiobook. It's a fantastic audiobook. I highly recommend it. As all my guests know, I have not, at least in my opinion, I haven't recommended a bad book yet. But it's The Bomb and America's Missile Age. It's about, I've done this every episode. I start getting excited and talking. Please introduce yourself, sir.
Okay, well, I'm Chris Gaynor, or Christopher, as it says on the book, and I'm a historian specializing in space exploration and aeronautics, and I'm the editor of Quest, the
Mhm.
History of Spaceflight Quarterly, um, and I'm actually based. I'm Canadian, and I live up in Victoria, BC. So
Okay.
I just have to step outside the door and walk about maybe 100 yards, and I can see the Mount Baker in Washington State. So I'm not that far away.
It's well, you're the second Canadian guest I have. I have a regular guest, my friend Rob, who's up in Toronto. So for um for your book, I love the sort of, and I say this in the best possible way, the simplicity of what you draw attention to. And it's not so much which missile system, it's not so much how it was, well, it is, but what you really draw attention to as a sort of a grand theme is what I believe Curtis LeMay was very interested in. And it was just, it's, let's break it down to the simplest pieces. What is the weapon? It's a fission bomb and later a fusion bomb. And what do we need to do with the weapon? We need to deliver it to a target. Everything else, it's like fill in the blanks however you feel necessary, but get it done. And we go from the silver plates. We go from the 10,000 pounds of bombs go at 10,000 miles. We go from these huge squadrons. We go from landing at Tinian and taking off and refueling and all that stuff to we go to Operation Paperclip V2 rockets to at its most base level. It's take the bomb, deliver the bomb. If it's and to just clearly I'm scrambling. This is what I do. I think it's interesting how you illuminate the sort of the tendency of individuals to develop an institution, an office, a set of sales and business acquisitions, and then that institution's uh, tendency to want to maintain itself and not necessarily be the most lethal or efficient mechanism. You would think the military would have no love lost with weapon systems. They would just want the newest things. But you point out time and time again, you have these pilots who are like, there's no place for a missile in the Air Force. It needs to be a pilot with wings. And you showed that's not necessarily the case. Do you believe that that's always been the case in the military?
Well, there's been a lot of historical writing about that. The One of the classic studies was done early in the 20th century about changes in naval gunnery practice.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and Actually, um, I kind of knock that down a little bit because the Air Force was in the early days of the space age, the Air Force was really criticized for not immediately seeing uh, the need for intercontinental ballistic missiles, and that they didn't start until 1954. And what I tried to do in this book is go back, to basically the end of Second World War, and look at what actually happened during that period, without sort of all the excitement and consternation that was stirred up when the Russians launched Sputnik before the United States could launch its satellites. And I what I kind of had to do was put myself in the position of people in the Air Force back at that time, and take a look at what they were dealing with. And what I found actually was that um, uh, it wasn't as it made more sense for them to start in 1954 than it did in 1945 or 46, because there were a lot of problems that had to be dealt with in terms of making America's nuclear deterrent effective. Um, the Air Force is often accused of just being a bunch of flyboys in love with their planes, and I looked at that, and I don't think it was quite that simple, because um, at the end of World War II, you had a situation where it had only a handful of bombs. They just couldn't start uh, grinding out nuclear weapons like like hot
like
dogs or
like
something,
sausages.
or sausages, as Khrushchev would say. um, and the U.S. didn't even have a policy, and I try and go over that policy. Uh, what the type of policy that I think we're familiar with really didn't come into play until about 1948. So it wasn't immediately after the war, because remember, during the war, the Soviet Union was America's ally
Mm-hmm.
in that struggle, and just things started to change fairly soon, but it just took time. It didn't happen overnight. And people argue about when the Cold War got going, but it there's no argument that it was going by 1948, and some people would say even the beginning of 1946. But anyway, things just kind of took time to get into their familiar place. Um, and then there was sort of the question of where was missile technology at the end of the war, and to develop what we know today is the intercontinental ballistic missiles. That also took time, and the big issue for the first decade or more after the war was the question of accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
Could uh, could a missile deliver a warhead to its target uh, accurately? And that was easier said than done. It took a number of years to advance that. And that, but the Air Force people also had this problem of uh, could could they even effectively and efficiently, shall we say, deliver nuclear weapons with bombers, where you had pilots on board. When, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, the B-29s had to go from Tinian, which was a distance from Japan, but certainly far short of the distances uh, that would be required to deliver weapons, say, from the continental United States
Mm-hmm.
to the Soviet Union. There's just a whole pile of issues there, and I think it makes sense. If I'm having trouble figuring out how to deliver weapons with a bomber with pilots on board, uh, it's going to be even tougher to do that with a missile with just with automatic devices
Yeah.
on board.
Yeah.
So anyway, these things all took time to develop. And then there's the other part of the argument. Well, it looks like the Russians started right after the war, and this was kind of encouraged by Soviet propaganda. Well, the truth finally came out, when the Soviet Union fell, uh, that the Soviet Union did not start their work on an intercontinental ballistic missile until the spring of 1954, which is the same time the United States did. So what was the big? Why did they both start at the same time? Um, well, uh, the reason was the hydrogen bomb.
Mm-hmm. You got to deliver it.
That's right. The hydrogen bomb, your average garden variety hydrogen bomb, if you can put it that way, uh, it, it's roughly 1,000 times more powerful, depending on the device, than say the first generation of
Mhm.
atomic bombs. And people don't realize that. You just think any atomic bomb, if you get it,
Just yeah,
within
big boom.
several miles of your target, it's going to do its thing. But that that really wasn't the case. Uh, Missiles weren't accurate enough to deliver an atomic bomb and be confident that it would do a lot of damage. I mean, wherever it hit, it would do a lot of damage, but it might not necessarily hit where you wanted it to.
Hmm.
So, so all of a sudden, when you have this gigantic increase in power, that kind of takes away the
Circular error probability. You don't need it as doesn't need it
exactly.
don't need to be as sharp when you've got a monster megaton warhead. Just
Yes.
get in the general direction.
So, um, so I kind of take the story up to the time in 1954 when they start building these missiles, and both sides do. And the story of the development of those early missiles is quite well told by other writers. But
Mhm.
there's uh, there's a little anniversary coming up this week. Um, One of the more interesting characters in this story on the Soviet side is a fellow named Andrei Sakharov, who I'm
Mhm.
sure you've heard of. And Andrei Sakharov, if he was still around, he'd be celebrating his 100th birthday in the next couple of days.
Jeez, it's yeah, it's I had never thought about that until your book. Why start developing missiles at the same date, or seriously developing intercontinental ballistic missiles? Obviously,
Yeah,
we grabbed paperclip scientists, they grabbed paperclip scientists, and
yeah.
it
There was work being done on missiles,
sure.
but they really had to step up their game for ICBMs. But Sakharov,
Oh yeah, sorry.
the interesting thing about Sakharov is that in 1950, President Truman announced we're going to start building a hydrogen bomb, and this was he was being lobbied heavily by a lot of scientists. And then when the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949, the pressure just became almost unbearable. So anyway, he started work on it, and of course, over in the Kremlin, they say, well, we've got to have one too, right? So everybody set to work on it, and the major Soviet developer of the hydrogen bomb was Sakharov. So when sort of in 1953, 1954, when the Kremlin was deciding uh, uh, about missiles, uh, like they're going to build this hydrogen bomb, and they thought it made sense to build a missile to deliver it. Uh, and And so they went to Sakharov and said, "How big is the hydrogen bomb going to be?" And he was uh, the concept he was working on at that particular time envisioned a hydrogen bomb that would weigh roughly 4 tons, I believe it was, in that neighborhood. And so they went to work at Korolev, and the rocket scientists in the Soviet Union went to work developing a rocket that could deliver a bomb that big to the United States. Meanwhile, in the United States, they tested a hydrogen bomb late in 1952, and it was a humongous monster thing. It weighed 68 tons or something. Like there was nothing on Earth that could take it anywhere, other than ground transportation.
It looked like a building. Yeah, Ivy Mike.
But it was already becoming clear that they were developing a means for a lightweight hydrogen bomb that would weigh only about a ton. So when the United States started on that, they basically developed something that could deliver a warhead of a ton. So this was a thing where America's technological superiority kind of tripped it up a little bit, because it built a smaller ICBM, and it was a much better ICBM than the R-7, which the Soviets were building. But the R-7 was a much better space launch vehicle, because you had this capacity to put 3 or 4 tons into orbit. Yeah. And this was why the Soviets were able to get Sputnik up first, why they were able to get the first human into space, why they were able to get the first probes to the moon. All those Soviet firsts were basically because Sakharov's guess
they couldn't shrink the bomb.
size of the hydrogen bomb was incorrect, And very soon, when the Soviets saw that the Americans had a smaller hydrogen bomb, they were eventually able to come around and build something like that. So
that's absolutely fascinating. It's
an incredible story. So there's going to be a little bit of publicity in the next few days about Sakharov's birthday, and we'll talk about how he's the father of the hydrogen bomb and how he was a great crusader for human rights. But it probably won't be talking about how his impact on the space race, because just imagine if the Soviets had not built such a big rocket and embarrassed the United States, and combined with the secrecy, nobody knew what was really going on in the Soviet Union for a number of years. For example, would President Kennedy have decided, well, we've got to show that we're serious about winning the space race, so we're going to send people to the moon in the 1960s.
Yeah.
It might have been, we might have gotten to the moon by now, but it might have been a lot later than 1969. All sorts of what if possibilities there.
Yeah, that there's so many of these weird contradictory flows, right? As soon as you build an atom bomb, you'd think they'd want a missile, but it's like an atom bomb, though big, is not big enough. It's not, we still have to be precise, and that's almost too lofty of a goal, so let's not build a missile at all. And then we shift from Ivy Mike, this massive shot cab, it looks like an aircraft hangar, and then we get them smaller to something maybe like Castle Bravo, and it's like, oh, now that it's bigger, now it's, although we've advanced with thermonuclear weapons, we can be less advanced with missiles. So now it's a viable it's not a pie in the sky dream. Let's actually make a missile. And then it's the whole, okay, Sakharov says 4 tons. So the Soviets, it's like, build a bigger rocket. It's like they have to build such a big thing that now they have this thing where their thermonuclear technological inferiority, a bigger bomb, 4 tons as opposed to 1 tons, actually now comes across as a technological superiority because they put up Sputnik, they put up Laika, the dog.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, they crashed the rover, or one of them crashed, but they got stuff to the moon, orbiters to the moon. It's this weird parallel of, like, it's through the looking glass, black is white and white is black, and it's like their fusion bombs are too big and or well, now I'm just repeating myself, but yeah, it's this weird. They suck at bombs, so they appear to be better at space, and we're better at bombs, so actually we appear to be inferior. And then it's this whole, and then we're not doing stuff because Eisenhower actually sees there is no missile gap. If anything, it favors us, as you so eloquently said. But he also doesn't want to reveal the U-2, so he can't say, actually, I have images. It's this weird chess game of, it melts your mind.
Yes. Yes. There are all sorts of things, and with the beginnings of Apollo, you had, when John F. Kennedy came to office, he was something of a skeptic about
Mhm.
space flight. But, Yuri Gagarin goes into space, people get upset, and then the next week he has the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah.
So he makes this decision to go to the moon in the 1960s, and most crucially, get support from the Congress for that, and which is never a given.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but some people argue uh, that if he hadn't have gone to Dallas, Apollo may have happened in a different manner.
Probably.
Late in his administration or his life, however you want to put it, Kennedy was getting a little sticker shock about Apollo, and of course he had to think about things like the cost of Vietnam, and he had to think about social programs and the rising civil rights movement. So he was getting cold feet at the end, and some people think that Apollo might have been held up, if if say he'd lived on and gotten a second term.
It's Yeah, that's another thing I had never learned until your book. Was I didn't realize the proximity between the time, how soon it was between Gagarin going to space, sort of another Soviet coup, like a propaganda coup, just like Sputnik, and the Bay of Pigs. I mean, what if the Bay of Pigs, they think that there was like Cuban intelligence in Miami, and maybe they figured it out. Kennedy, he kind of said, don't give them all the air. The CIA assumed Kennedy would give them any air power they needed because Eisenhower was kind of like that. But then Kennedy was like, I don't want this whole U.S. armada of B-29s down there. You can't give them air support. So the Cubans get bogged down on the beach. They all get executed, and it's like somehow that embarrassment kind of turned into, we need to go to the moon and do the other things by the end of this decade, not because it is easy, but because it is hard, right?
That's right. That's right.
It's this weird, the butterfly effect, right? If you go back in time, it's like, don't touch anything because I mean,
Exactly.
truly, what if the special activities division of the CIA, what if they had landed 10 minutes earlier at the Bay of Pigs and it was a success? Would we have gone to the moon? Like, it makes your mind, if you can't tell, I get excited about this stuff, but it makes your mind
Right.
spin. It makes your
Right.
mind spin. It's it's and I would assume about Project Orion, the nuclear powered
Oh
space,
yes.
right? The bombs and the choo-choo. Well, Kennedy Kennedy actually was a little turned off by that, not because of it's still a brilliant idea, but because apparently the Joint Chiefs of Staff also floated an idea of, well, instead of having one of these go out to Mars, what if we had one orbit the Earth? And what if, instead of dropping bombs as a propulsion, what if it dropped bombs on target? An orbital nuclear battleship. And Kennedy was wildly turned off by that. I mean, you got to think, would he have nixed the entire Apollo program had he lived and not gone to Dallas? because maybe he would have started seeing this all as, is this going to turn into another military race? Granted, that's all speculation, but
Yeah, well, that's an interesting story. And in the early days of or after the war, there was a lot of thought and effort put over to the idea of nuclear fueled rockets. And
never
um,
the.
and I think if you talk to kind of your say leader of military technology in the late 40s, especially, uh, um, you would have heard a lot of talk about nuclear powered rockets and nuclear powered aircraft and things like that.
NEPA.
Uh, and that was actually, I think, one of the reasons why uh, there was a bit of a delay in getting ICBMs going, because people were thinking a large chemical rocket may not necessarily be the way to go. And and even as late as the time of Kennedy, there was still a lot of interest in that. For example, if you read the speech he gave where he announced the Apollo, his idea to go to the moon, set that goal in 1961. Uh, he also talks about funding support for something called Project Rover, which was actually a nuclear rocket, which was kind of seen as something a bit more distant than Apollo, but perhaps a way to get to Mars, or for you know other space exploration and perhaps military purposes. But yeah, a lot of the nuclear programs were actually ultimately killed, sort of later on in Kennedy's term, and under President Johnson, I think.
It's yeah, you had NEPA, right? It was that nuclear powered
Yes.
B-36, and the Soviets had their version, and in that true Soviet fashion, they just took off the shielding. Why not? Who cares if the pilots die? That that kind of Soviet mindset. But it's kind of Occam's razor, right? How complex is this thing? How well trained is the crew going to need to be? Is every one of these a flying liability? If it crashes, is there nuclear waste? Versus if we can get some if we can get some solid fueled rockets, or at least hypergolic fluids, if we can just have these things ready to go, you have to think of your average soldier in the field. It's like your average guy in Normandy or the Battle of the Bulge. It's like they got to be able to take the gun, like clear it, aim it, and fire. Like it's got to be ready to go. You maybe don't want to have these highly trained crews for every plane when you could just loosely, light the rocket and let it go. It's I'm glad you touched on Project Pluto, because not a lot of people do. And it's one of my favorite historical aspects of the Cold War that I don't think gets nearly enough attention. And for everybody listening, it's a nuclear powered ramjet that the biggest model they made, I think, was a 50 megawatt, but they wanted it to be 500 megawatts. It could fly for months on end in a holding pattern. It held multiple thermonuclear bombs. And when it was aimed at, let's say, the Soviet Union, it would fly along, dropping bombs at each target, all the while flying at treetop at Mach 3, and it had the same mass as a diesel locomotive, shockwave killing people, breaking infrastructure, spewing radioactive exhaust, and then dropping nukes on cities, and then finally, in its final act, after months of flying around at treetop level, it could then act as a kamikaze and go right into a final target and basically create a Chernobyl. That's all real. That I'm
Yeah.
sure I probably exaggerated a little bit, but you touched on it, and I'm glad you did, because I can't find any other authors that do. There are documentaries about it, but there aren't any good books about it, and I'm glad you touched on it.
The 1950s were really the salad days for experimental
Yeah.
ideas, in military technology. You think of uh, well, things like just what you spoke about, these various nuclear weapons, nuclear rockets, different aircraft concepts, the X series of aircraft,
Mhm.
all sorts of weird and wonderful things.
Yeah.
There would be money for it,
Yeah.
for about a decade, and then that kind of ended. But of course, things like the flying flapjack and amazing things, and um, it must have been fun to be a test pilot in those days. And of
Yeah.
course, a lot of those people wound up becoming astronauts, but
Yeah. Well,
um, I don't think it's the same now.
no, it's not. One of the guests I've had on here, Charlie Duke, 10th man to walk on the moon.
Right.
He he talked about, because I remember asking him, I was like, "How did you become an astronaut?" Because I never really thought about it, but I was like, astronauts didn't exist. So when you're a little kid, I want to be a firefighter, I want to be a baseball player. There were no astronauts for you to look up to. And what he said is there was no end goal to become an astronaut. You were just kind of looking for the most advanced bleeding edge thing. You were just kind of chasing that high. Faster planes, are you a Chucky Yeager breaking the sound barrier? And he brought up, I don't believe he was an X-15 pilot, but he brought up the X-15. And he was like, you have the X-15 and it's flying at 300,000 feet. And it's
Yeah.
one thing led to another. And then finally it was like, we're going to go to the moon. And it was just like, let's go to the moon. Of course you want to be that guy. Who doesn't? If you're in the Air Force, who doesn't want to be at the most bleeding edge, go walk on another celestial body? It's
That's right. Yeah, because a lot of them they were
pilots.
just really pilots on
Mhm.
steroids, so to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah.
Well, there were two X-15 pilots who became
Mhm.
astronauts. Some
Armstrong.
X-15 folks got astronaut wings because the X-15 went so high, but
Yeah,
the two joined NASA were, of course, Neil Armstrong, who you may have heard of,
yeah,
and Joe Engle,
yeah,
who he was supposed to fly in Apollo, but he got bounced and wound up flying in the shuttle, and he's still around.
yeah. It's
Um, so, but yeah, Neil Armstrong, I never met him, but everybody who does said he just he just loved flying anything, anything he could get off the ground.
yeah,
And that was, the most important part of Apollo 11 for him was making sure was getting that landing right.
yeah, yeah.
That was
Yeah,
far more important to him than
then-
what he said when he stepped down on the surface.
yeah. He's a pilot. He doesn't care about walking on the ground. It's
That's right.
yeah. He
That's
wanted
right.
to.
And,
Yeah,
he even when he kind of left the business, I think he kept flying. He was a glider pilot, and I think if he could get his hands on a business jet or something like that, away he'd go. So
what's interesting is Charlie Duke was the guy talking to Neil at
that's
the
right.
when you hear those old recordings, Houston, the Eagle has landed. Oh, you got a bunch of guys down here holding or turning blue, holding their breath. That's Charlie Duke. In a weird kind of fun fact twist for Project Pluto, what we've been talking about, one of the one of the companies contracted for Project Pluto was actually Coors, the beer company, because they created the fuel rods. They created the ceramics.
Right.
Charlie Duke actually went and worked for Coors for a little bit after
Yes,
the
he was the distributor, I think,
yeah,
for a while, and
yeah,
he made some good money doing it, I think.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of this like weird kind of incestuous this channels. Um, Yeah, there is. It's kind of a romantic thing to look back at that time. I mean, one, you have the funding to do anything, much like in the wake of 9/11. It's anything you can come up with. There's a fight terrorism, funded. Don't say no more. It's funded. Whatever you want. But there was also that sort of that, I guess, really true awe at the final frontier. It was no one knew what happened when you broke the sound barrier. Yeah, the X-15 went over the Kármán line. You're an astronaut now. We're gonna launch you off. We're gonna launch you off a B-52. We don't know if you're gonna melt or not. We go to Mach 7. Let's see what happens. To can we get to space? Can we survive space? Can we go to the moon? There was very much we can look back at it now and we know it all, and we're looking back at it with knowledge of the events that happened. But at the time, it was just this black wall, this event horizon of no one knew what was going to come next. And these guys were just wheeling and dealing, like a very almost a Wild West kind of vibe, right? It's, do you think we will get back to that? Do you think that, are we back there already with Blue Origin and SpaceX? Are we kind of getting back into those glory days of, the future? Everyone will live in the space and run on nuclear power. Are we getting back to that maybe?
I'm I'm not sure if we're getting back to say where we were at in the 50s and 60s, but the- we're I think we're kind of moving out of a period of stasis, shall we say?
Yeah.
Um, because you have for a long time, space exploration was just kind of supported entirely by the government, and and after Apollo 11, the governments, regardless of the political stripe, listened to all those people who said, "Hey, we have these problems here on Earth. Let's deal with them." And, but now we actually have, uh, private entities, billionaires, and corporations that are actually have some of their own skin in the game. And Now they're still getting a lot of government support.
Yeah.
Uh,
Contracts.
you know, NASA NASA is changing its role from kind of directing everything to being more like the anchor tenant. You
Yeah.
know, for uh, but in a few months we're going to see some launches of dragons that you know are really have nothing to do with NASA. What is it? They're sending up five five people that some and some multimillionaires paying the freight,
Yeah.
stuff like
Yeah.
that. So and Elon Musk says we want to go to Mars. So we are getting into I think a bit more dynamic phase. Whether it'll be as exciting as it was 50, 60 years ago remains to be seen, but it's certainly going in that direction.
Yeah. You well said. We're coming out of an era of stagnation, and it's still very government supported. If maybe indirectly, but I mean, SpaceX also makes a killing off, NRO contracts, putting satellites up there. But, and as you said, yeah, NASA less of the overlord and now more sort of the maybe just directing traffic in, and I don't say that in any negative way, sort of, yeah, the
Right.
anchor tenant. It's, but no matter why we get there or how we get there, I think it's important that we get there, whether it's some morally questionable bringing back some Nazi scientists to the United States, whether it's putting up a space shuttle, or whether it's launching satellites, or whether it's putting millionaires around the moon for a nice vacation, or whether it's going to Mars. No matter how it happens or why it happens, or whether it's, Starlink, satellite internet, or mining asteroids, or learning how to develop or to deliver nuclear weapons to thousands of miles away. What is happening with all of those over the decades, no matter the country, no matter the corporation, is it's slowly refining and improving the reliability and efficacy that we can get to space. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And uh, some of the people who are in the forefront of this movement, like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and even some people who've been around NASA were inspired in the 1970s by uh, Gerard O'Neill and his ideas of colonies in space. Um, I'm not sure if that's all going to work out, but or at least in the short term or intermediate term, but but it is having an effect on people's ideas today. Uh, so yeah, that's an interesting thing. There was, I think, very recently, just a few weeks ago, I saw a new film out about O'Neill and his work. So people are starting to talk about that again. He was quite big in the '70s, and of course he passed away in the '90s. So it's kind of forgotten a little bit.
I was just thinking there's kind of right now when you see Bezos and Musk is sort of the Joker, the high and wild kind of all everything out on the table. Bezos is more of like the poker player. It almost is perfectly fitting that we have these two personalities because history, especially of space flight and things related to it, are also these big personalities, right? You got Edward Teller, who apparently it was like working with a petulant child. Brilliant physician, patriotic American, wanted to fight communism, but was always, no, we are working on this, nothing else. He met with Ulam and the Teller Ulam, and then Ulam said he never spoke to him. Teller never spoke to him again. He testified against Oppenheimer. We have all these big. We have Curtis LeMay, the
Yeah,
cigar chomping. We don't need missiles, we need bombers. And you have these big egos sort of bucking at each other, but I would say it's almost par for the course, right? We got Elon Musk and Bezos, and it's like, yeah, this makes sense. This is how it's supposed to be. For better or worse, it seems to be this is how it goes.
well, yes, and Teller and LeMay are big characters in my book here.
Mm-hmm.
Far be it for me to, you know, I mean, Curtis LeMay isn't the world's most attractive character, um, but his, I more or less say that his skepticism about missiles in the early days was perhaps a little better founded than people gave him credit for, and um, it would be interesting to do kind of more research on his attitude, say during the time he was chief of staff of the
Mm-hmm.
Air Force, which by then missiles were coming into their own.
Yeah.
But earlier on, he was he was really pushing the bombers. But as I said in the book, they were having trouble. Uh, making bombers an effective delivery system for nuclear weapons, let alone missiles. So I think it's a bit more understandable
Mm-hmm.
than some people say his attitude on that.
Oh no, I'm a huge fan of Curtis LeMay. I always talk about him on this podcast. Sure, he had his drawbacks, but it's kind of like what Kennedy said. You you don't want LeMay deciding whether or not you go to war.
That's
But if
right.
you are going to war, you want LeMay leading the fight, right? It's kind of like Patton. You want like a more measured Eisenhower, but if you are going to war and you're fighting the Nazis, it's like take the leash off Patton. Just let him run wild. But it's yeah,
And he was a very effective organizer. When he
yeah.
was put in charge of the Strategic Air
Oh my
Command, it was a
God,
mess.
he cleaned it all up. It's like what you
Yeah.
you, you quoted Richard Rhodes, and I love Richard Rhodes, and Dark Sun. Not one bomber completed the mission. Not one. LeMay went from place to place, right? The bombers going over at 1,500 feet instead of at 30,000. LeMay was, we are at war. So when that war comes, it's no different. It's the same. He went from base to base, starting at Offutt, went through the whole thing and cleaned it up and organized it. I mean, you got to give credit where credit's due. The guy was an animal. And I say that in the best way. And you could almost, as Richard Rhodes talks about in Dark Sun, the making of the hydrogen bomb. Well, first of all, back to what you said very early in this podcast. I mean, it was probably not until about 2 years ago. I'm 30 years old now that I realized hydrogen bombs were not just a bigger A bomb. It wasn't, an SUV and then you have a city bus, which is bigger than an SUV. But it's no, like the hydrogen bomb was more like a cruise ship. It was an entirely different thing. And what dawned on me was if you ever look at tests of A bombs somewhere in the ocean, but just one big indicator is you can always look at the surroundings, right? Desert out in Nevada, and you got the mountains, and you can kind of see some stuff in the foreground. Every hydrogen bomb test, it's this much more abstract, just general area of the sky, and in the foreground are clouds. And you'll look at the difference in the A bomb, the flash goes and then it dissipates, and you see the mushroom cloud rising. The hydrogen bomb, the entire sky is red as this thing just rises. Not really at all similar. So just, yeah, that to what you were saying earlier. But to finish up this rambling, what Richard Rhodes said is when Teller met with Ulam, at first he was very, very skeptical. And then as 10 minutes went by, 20 minutes went by, he became accepting and then very enthusiastic about it. You could maybe argue, and you would know better than me, you could maybe argue that LeMay was the same with missiles, because when we look at how rabid he was about getting the XB-70, the supersonic bomber, which is basically the SR-71 but as a bomber, you could almost say that was probably the beginning of his love for what? A super fast delivery system that had a low rate of interception from the enemy. That's almost, I would say, laid the ground for him to I would imagine, it's granted it's all speculation, I would imagine that's probably there's the beginning steps to him accepting the missile as, oh, this is just the most superior delivery system. Would you say that there's any accuracy to that, or am I just rambling?
Uh, yeah, I, I think there's something to be said about that, but I don't um, I'm not that well informed about sort of what he was saying at that point in his career, because
Mhm.
I was concentrating on the earlier time before he became chief of staff.
Mhm.
So, but that's actually a good question, and I think it should be researched a little bit more.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it until we were talking. I've got you for 10 more minutes, so I also wanted to kind of pivot again. Just like Project Pluto, you bring up something else that never really gets brought up that I was a huge fan of, and it's the Silbervogel, which so we have the space shuttle. The space shuttle was preceded by the theoretical X-20 dinosaur, which itself was preceded by the was it the antipodal bomber, the
The antipodal bomber, yes, or the
Sanger. Yeah, he wanted a basically it was like a weird mix of like a 1940s theoretical hybrid between a space shuttle and ICBM, but the similarities were all there. Take off from the ground, use rockets to get really high up, use the atmosphere to bounce, and then it would drop a nuke on New York, and then it would land in Japanese controlled islands in the Pacific. It's very early. It's a very early concept of a space shuttle and sort of an ICBM. But no one ever brings it up, and I don't know why. And I'm so happy you did, because to me it's the most absurd thing that they were planning this in the 40s.
well, there's all sorts of things. I also mentioned this, when they're having problems with the guidance system, they actually researched the idea of putting pigeons in the nose cone of the rockets, and having the pigeons direct
Yeah,
the missile to the target. So yes, they tried all sorts of things.
yeah. It's it is absurd, but it's also you also go into some more interesting more meta themes of the Cold War, and perhaps the differences between the United States and a closed society as the Soviet Union, was the actual use of the paperclip scientists. I mean, you can go, granted, I am biased. I'm an American and I love America, but you can see where we went in and what did we do? We grabbed the Nazis and we promised them freedom, a good life, which did they deserve? Probably not. Versus the Soviets, got them really drunk and then threw them on the trains. We brought them and kind of extracted the information from their mind, worked with them, again, ethically questionable. Whereas the Soviets took them and kind of compartmentalized them and didn't really let them in to the inner circles. Now, is that some Soviet punishment for the losses inflicted by the Third Reich on them? Who knows? Or was it just a reflection of their society of you don't let everyone intermix. You keep it compartmentalized. You keep it separated.
Well, I think it's both, but you got to remember that the uh, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, and the Soviets took 20 million casualties.
Yeah.
Um, and the Germans, uh, their the way the Germans dealt with the Soviet people during the occupation is a really dark chapter of the war.
Hmm.
Uh, they just considered them subhuman. They were only slightly better than Jews in their eyes, and they were treated very badly. And a lot of people, looking back on that, realize, say why that the Germans were really kooky to do that because a lot of the Soviet people, especially in the Ukraine, they occupied the whole of Ukraine, and those people weren't exactly in love with the Soviets because he basically forced a famine on them in the 1930s, and they would have happily worked with him. But then the Germans came in. They were greeted as liberators by many of those people, and then they quickly found out that the Germans were treating them worse. So so there were some hatreds going on there, and so in the United States and other countries, we all remember the Second World War, but nothing like the Soviets because they occupied it. Um, they occupied a big chunk of that country, and a lot of people died, and a lot of people who didn't die suffered greatly. So I
Yeah.
think that has to be considered.
Yeah. It doesn't get brought up a lot in the history of World War II. And the more you look into it, the more similar you see the United States and the Soviet Union as like bodies. I mean, why didn't we want to give up? Why did we hold on to Okinawa? Why did we hold on to all these bases after World War II? And a lot of senators and congressmen and women openly said these were bought and paid for with American lives. Why are we giving them up? Well,
Right.
you could argue the same with the Soviets. Was it when Richard Bissell went and met with, I think it was him, went and met with Stalin about how much, when asked him after the war, how much further is the Soviet Union going to go? And Stalin said not much further. But the reason he didn't want to give up all of their sort of holdings, if you will, much like the Iwo Jima was our holding, was they paid for it in a level of human life that we didn't even come close to. And I'm not, the living under a Soviet satellite block nation was a horrible fate, and I'm not trying to lighten that in any way, but to at least put myself in the mind of Stalin, if I can, is, yeah, I mean, they just paid for it with these unimaginable losses, and the Americans paid with it with a fraction of our losses, and they are openly talking about keeping their bases. why would we give up ours? Why wouldn't we get some of the spoils of war? Why wouldn't you? You took on so many losses. Why wouldn't you? And it's yeah, the Soviet losses were absolutely unimaginable, and it's very easy for us to say, America, we won World War II, and it's like, dude, like the Soviets kind of got us to the goal line. We ran in the touchdown, but you can't discount their efforts, their participation. And now we're not even touching on anything remotely close to your book with nuclear weapons and missiles. We're diving off into occupations, but the book, one more time, everybody, it's on Audible. The Bomb in America's Missile Age. It's a fantastic listen. Some fun things in there.
And it's also in hardback too, of course,
Oh yeah,
from
awesome,
Johns Hopkins University Press.
beautiful. I will put that in the description as always. Um, some fun facts, real quick. I always knew that McNamara was the CEO of Ford, and
Yes,
and he was I always knew that factoid that he was brought on as the Secretary of Defense. I didn't know that one of the missile programs was headed by a guy plucked from Chrysler, and you talked about that, and it's
that's right. Well, and one of Eisenhower's defense secretaries, I think, had did a big shot at General Motors or something like that. And yeah,
was the little known headhunting of the military industrial complex from like Detroit, right? Just going and
yes,
getting
that's
yeah.
that's right. Yeah, I talk about a fellow named K.T. Keller, who
Mm-hmm.
was a guy who ran Chrysler after Chrysler
Yeah.
himself left the scene, and he started ramping up the missile program a little bit, although it actually didn't. And this was under President Truman, but it really didn't get going until Eisenhower got in, and the hydrogen bomb had been developed. So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
that's an and yes, there and Eisenhower, if my memory serves me right, um, uh, he had the former head of GM named Charlie Wilson, and uh, also the former head of GE, who was also named Charlie Wilson. So the one was called, Engine Charlie, and the other was called Electric Charlie. I think that's how they distinguished them.
It's it's man, that could be a cool book in itself. The unknown, I guess, the unknown role that the automobile industry played in a Cold War military industrial complex. In well, I was gonna say one thing you said, yeah, about Keller. He had one of the programs had a catchy name. It was like the Keller Accelerated Program or a
Yes,
Keller Acceler or whatever it was. I thought it was
or
interesting.
that's what von Braun called it.
Oh, okay.
But but anyway, yes, Keller Keller kind of helped von Braun get going because he in the first few years after the war he was kind of in the wilderness in a sense.
Yeah.
They were launching V2s, and then
Yeah.
they got this kind of modest program that led to the Redstone. But Keller came in and knocked some heads together
Yeah.
and helped get it
Oh,
going.
I guess it makes sense. I guess it makes if we can. I know I said we'd finish up if we can go for a couple more minutes. I guess it makes sense though, right? Because you're bringing in the heads of these private industries who rose to their positions through skill, through competency, unless there was some nepotism, but I don't think it was. So what? So let's break it down into its base pieces. What is it? It's these super efficient businessmen who knew how to streamline a process, much like LeMay with Strategic Air Command. So whereas you have these sort of geniuses like a von Braun, it's you're sort of rudderless. It came over after the war. There's no real goal. It's like, hey, we brought back pieces of V2 rockets. Some of them got damaged by like seawater, so they're corroded. But it's just kind of in general like firing off rockets, and versus you kind of bring in this business mind and you put a goal on the horizon, and it's now let's like you said let's bash some heads together and let's get it going. And yeah, I mean, kind of like pilots taking that opportunity to go to the moon, even though it seems very different from flying planes. It's like it's the ultimate rung of achievement. I guess it makes sense that maybe that's why McNamara or Keller, maybe that's why they came on, because it's like they rose to the top of their industry, and like now they want to go to the Olympics. And it was what's the Olympics? It's like working on a classified program for the president for missiles. I mean, maybe, right? Rex Tillerson being Secretary of State. I mean, maybe there seems to be a precedent of it, right? I don't know, for better or
Yeah,
worse.
yes, yes, in a sense, maybe not for Secretary of State, but
Yeah.
there is a, in a general sense that,
Yeah, yeah, maybe not the best example, Secretary.
well, actually, come to think of it, uh, when FDR was president, most of the time the Secretary of State was a guy named Cordell Hull. And although to
Mhm.
tell the truth, Roosevelt was one of these people who was his own Secretary of State. But right at the end, Cordell Hull was replaced by a guy named Edward Stettinius, who continued for a few months into Truman's time. And I believe he used to be the head of U.S. Steel.
Hmm.
Uh, so so anyway, there is that precedent there. Of
Yeah.
course, McNamara is a fascinating character. People uh, people go on a great deal about him in Vietnam, as they should, but the way he handled technology
Fascinating.
was a big thing. The F-35 and things like that,
Yeah.
um, which is an attempt to make a one size fits all for the various forces, and that's that's quite a story in and of itself.
Yeah, $1 trillion boondoggle. Yeah, no, McNamara, right? They were using electronics to drop on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He was. It seems like McNamara maybe would have been better suited at like DARPA. Seemed like
Yeah,
he was looking really far ahead.
but yeah,
Than
I mean, he canceled things like dinosaur and all this,
I
and
know, and I don't think I can ever
some
forgive
people
him.
called him Mac the Knife. So there
Yeah,
you
I
go.
know. I don't know if
I
I can ever forgive McNamara for canceling Dinosaur and the XB-70. Those are some. Those are easier, right? It's easy for me to say in
Yeah,
2021. I'm not the Secretary of Defense. Real quick, and I hadn't made the connection until just now when you were mentioning those other business leaders. In Garrett Graff's book Raven Rock, it's a fantastic book. It's all about the nuclear bunkers. It's it was classified for a long time, but Eisenhower had something called the czar system, which we have czars now, but his czar system was he had these like 12 czars from all aspects of private industry in the United States. It's like manufacturing, it's like agriculture, construction, just kind of a very broad, if you could get the most 12 encompassing areas. And he kind of took the top guys, like CEOs, presidents, and he established the czar system. And what the czar system was, these guys were given priority to be saved in the event of a nuclear war. Them and their families were given the same security like clearances as top generals, because Eisenhower wanted these guys to rebuild America after an all-out nuclear strike. And it would be a greatly consolidated power source that probably would have been martial law for a couple decades. But Eisenhower, ever the logistician magician, it's he he wanted to take in these private leaders as a vital, as an essential asset to save in the event of a nuclear holocaust, because who could better rebuild a society with less than favorable circumstances? How could they use it most efficiently? Figured, why not? These guys already did it in the real world. Why not bring them back in when everything's in an irradiated wasteland? It's Yeah, there seems to be a very weird an underbelly, not an underbelly because that's a negative word. But yeah, there does seem to be a precedent of like you pluck the top minds and then they come work for you. I don't know what I'm talking about now. I'm going off. But Dr. Gaynor, thank you so much for coming on my podcast, sir. I would love to chat with you again sometime. And again, your book will be in the description. It's a fantastic listen. There are fun facts in there that I hadn't known about. I didn't know that some B-29s crash landed in the Soviet Union and Stalin refused to give them back to us.
That's right.
I never knew that. Do you want it to be in English or in Cyrillic, or do you want it? That's how similar. I never knew that they reverse engineered our B-29s.
That's right. Yep.
Fantastic, fantastic book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I haven't recommended a bad book yet, or at least no one's told me I have. I don't think this is going to be the one that breaks that pattern. Dr. Gaynor, thank you so much, sir. I'll email you when this episode is up. Guys, go grab the book on Audible or a real paperback copy, and I'll send you the link when it's up. I would love to talk to you again. Now I'm just rambling. I'm a huge fan. Thank you, sir. Your book is fantastic, touched on all the subjects I love. And for anybody that's a fan of this stuff, it's a book you need to get. So with that, I will let you go. I have kept you 7 minutes longer than I said I would. So Dr. Gaynor, thank you for your patience, sir. Thank you for coming on my podcast, and hope to talk to you again sometime.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you, sir. You have a good one.